Hello friends, Crystal Joy of CJoy Yoga, and we're going to break down Tadasana, which is a very fancy Sanskrit name that translates into English as mountain pose. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at mountain pose, and this is totally for all my beginner friends who are trying to figure out what in the heck yoga is and how to do it. This is also from all my advanced friends who probably haven't broken down Tadasana in some time. Come back to it, break it down real nice and good, and just kind of see, that's right, I forgot about lifting my arch. Oh, that's right, I forgot, right? I come back to this, it's the blueprint pose. In yoga, we call it the blueprint pose for every standing pose, and think it's one of the most important poses in yoga for that reason. All the other standing poses that we do, many lying poses, seated poses, still have elements of Tadasana in them, right? So we're going to take we're going to take a few moments, and we're going to break this puppy down. So don't do anything. Just go ahead and try to stand. Imagine if you were at the grocery mart, right, and you had one of those little baskets on your arm, and I want you to stand in line at the grocery store and just kind of see how you stand. If I'm completely honest, mine usually looks something like this, right? And not that I'm always in line at the grocery store, but I find myself repeating this pose an awful lot. And so there's nothing symmetrical about the pose, right? My posture is not doing great, and I'm starting to set my body into some pretty big asymmetries if I start to do this all the time. My toes turn out, so I start to compress my low back, right? I put all of my weight over into my left hip. My left hip juts out a little bit, so I start to get a little bit of an overstretching of my gluteals on this side. This side starts to get a little tight because they're not being used as much. My knee gives me a little bit of grief for a few different reasons, but one of them being this position and just, you know, the way I utilize or hyperextend my knees. We'll talk a little bit about that. So just kind of notice my spine's a little off kilter, my hips are a little off kilter. Yeah? Point being, the way that we normally stand starts to set up asymmetries in the body for our posture, our bones, our muscles, the health. So I want you to go ahead and start by simply putting the weight evenly into both feet, and we'll go a little more in depth in that in a moment. I want you to look down and see if you have a tendency towards what I call duck feet, where the feet are way out to the side, yeah? Or are they more towards pigeon-toed? One's not better than the other. They're both asymmetrical, but we go to one or the other. Yeah, there's very few people who are not neutrally aligned, not naturally, naturally neutrally aligned. Say that 5 times fast. So now go ahead, and whichever you need to do, either taking the toes out away from each other or bringing the toes in, I want you to go ahead and stand with the feet parallel, hip distance. And when I say hip distance, I don't mean the outer edges of the hip, right? I mean from where the greater trochanter, the ball, enters the socket. If you're like, what? Bring your hands onto your frontal hip points, the as-is bones. I want you to sit back into an imaginary chair just a little bit. It's a pretty high chair, it's a stool, yeah? And then slip your fingers straight down into the hip crease, right where that crease happens, and go ahead and stand up. Now where your fingers ended up, that is very close, if not on, right, where your hip joint is inside the body. And when I say hip distance, that's where your heels should be under, yeah? So make sure your heels are under your hips and that your toes are straight forward. You're going to pitch a little too far forward. There's no weight in the heels. My poor body is trying to keep all of this up. The back body has to work like the dickens to keep the weight of the head up and to keep that upper body up, right? And if I pitch my weight all the way back, do it, right? Now suddenly my front body is starting to contract and tense to try to hold myself up to stop from going back. So go ahead and do those actions a little quicker, a little smaller, and do them a couple of times until you find that you are equally distributed from the front of your mat to the back of your mat, yeah? Or to the front of your feet, sorry, to the back of your feet. And find the very middle from front to back. Go a little too far to the right. All the weight's in that outer left, right foot for you. The hip kind of wants to pop out, right? The neck is getting a little tweaked. Go ahead and come all the way over. Many other things too. Those are just a couple of them. A little too far to the left. And go ahead and make that motion a little smaller and a little quicker, but I don't mean you have to move fast, right? And go ahead and go back and forth from right to left until you find that you're right in the middle of the feet. There are what I call 4 corners or 4 wheels we're going to talk about, especially at the beginning stage of yoga. There's the ball mound of the big toe. There's the ball mound of the pinky toe. There's the inner heel and there is the outer heel. Imagine that there are 4 wheels on a car, right? Or your 4 corners of your foot. So what we just did, hopefully distributed the weight evenly into all 4 corners of both feet. But check into it mentally, your proprioceptive sense, and just find out, and if not, make any corrections that need to happen. And as we start to press down through all 4 corners, suddenly, right, we already start to stand up a little taller. Our posture starts to correct itself. We still have a few more things to run through. This is just the feet. Now, as you're pushing down through the 4 corners of the feet push down, but the arches and the ankles should be lifting up. Huh? I know. Look down. You'll lose your upper back. We'll come back to it. Look at your inner arch, right? Your inner lateral arch. If you don't know, you've got 4 arches in your foot, and I want your mind's eye in the main one that you know about. And then from there, I want you to go ahead and I want you to look at that while you lift your toes up. Spread your toes really wide, and notice how your inner arch just lifted off the ground. By the way, if you're someone who collapses your arches, this is fantastic work to add in on a regular basis. As you spread the toes wide, keep the arches lifted, set the toes back down onto the earth, and don't grab with the toes, just lay them out flat and soften them. Hopefully the arches are lifted. Now bring your awareness into your outer ankle. Keep the arches lifted, don't collapse the arches, but hug your outer ankles a little in and lift them up to the outer hips. Yeah? So the feet are all set, the ankles are all set, awesome. Now go ahead and bend the knees just a little bit. They don't have to bend much. Keep all that work in the feet. Every time we set something up below, you keep it as we move up the body. Don't lose it, and you will a little bit, but you keep as much as you can, right? With a little bend in the knees, when you start to straighten the knees, I want you to go ahead and start to pull your quadriceps, right? Activate them, or start to pull them up, or think of pulling the kneecaps up as you go to straighten the legs. And it should feel like you've got a lot of muscularity, right? Or things are turned on, fired up, all the way up towards the pelvis. Many of us tend to send our thighs forward, going into an unneutral, is that a word? An unneutral rotation, right? Or alignment. So you want to go ahead and not only pull the kneecaps up or activate the quads, but also send the thighs back a little bit. You'll end up with a little more weight in your heels. Awesome, right? Now we're good all the way through, thighs moving back. But if I push my thighs back, my buttocks want to stick out. And they can in the beginning to find the thighs, but then keep the thighs moving back. This is the dance, right? If you do one thing in a big way, it does another action, and we have to do a counter action against that. So as the thighs move back, go ahead and see if those buttocks flesh can reach down, or you can think of your frontal hip points lightly pulling up so that you come into what's called a neutral pelvis. Neutral is a range, but when we're still and standing, we want it to be still and standing and neutral with us, right? So the frontal hip points up, buttocks flesh down, thighs are still moving back, feet are pushing down, ankles and arches and kneecaps are lifting up. Now from there, go ahead and check in with the low floating ribs, right? When we pull the frontal hip points up, we tend to overarch, not all of us, some of us. So we're gonna, salud. We're gonna soften the low floating ribs down. I like to think of it actually as lifting the back ribs up off of the back waist, right? So as my buttocks flesh moves down and my back ribs lift up, I get that beautiful length in the low back. Now, shoulder heads, go ahead and lift them. That's the outer shoulders. Lift them up just a little bit, not much. Move them back, slide them softly down. Inhale, expand across the collarbone, out through the outer shoulders. And exhale, go ahead and reach the palms forward and reach them down. Now with the next inhale, can you expand between your shoulder blades, right, all the way out to the outer shoulders so that you have equal space on both sides of the body here. And exhale, again, using the triceps lightly, we reach the hands down, palms are turning forward towards the front of the room. And it shouldn't be rigid. That's a mistake I see a lot, especially with my eager beavers and my type A personalities, and I did it for years, right? It's a softness about it. Yoga means union, so remember, we're looking for balance. We want muscular action along with certain softness, right? From there, just check in with the neck. Your chin should be parallel to the ground, and then all four sides of the neck are long. And again, I'm not pushing my head up. I'm just lengthening it, that's all, crown of the head lifting up. So it should feel like you are working, like there's a lot of muscles fired up to maintain this, but not fired up so much that you're extremely tired and you can't hold the posture, right? And although you can't hold this 24 hours a day, every once in a while throughout your day, it's pretty easy to slip this in no matter where you are, right? It's not a yoga pose that seems strange or you're worried about people looking at you or any of those things. Anywhere you can just kind of slip into this Tadasana. And notice how now, hopefully, my ears are over my shoulders, middle of my shoulders, the middle of my hips, the middle of my knees, and the middle of my ankles. So that 15-pound bowling ball, 13 to 15 pounds, your head is your brain, your skull, all that stuff. Instead of it pitching forward and causing that arching of the back, right, that dowager's hump, because all those muscles are trying to hold it up. Instead of it moving all the way back and causing a whole other set of issues and lordosis in the low back, right, it's balanced in the architecture of the spine, and it's sitting on top of the spinal column in kind of a nice, easy manner. And in the beginning, nothing feels easy about this posture. It feels like an awful lot of work, right? But then you'll start to find things, right, soften a little bit. You work the muscular action, and then you find a certain sense of softness. And we start to correct some of those asymmetries that we may have had in our body. And by the way, one more thing before we end here. If you have been in a dowager's hump, driving, computering, drawing, painting, etc., right? If this is a natural position for you, the dowager's hump, for 30 years, do you think it's going to correct itself and you're going to be able to stand in that super tall, with a sense of ease, Tadasana, with two classes? It takes a little bit of time to start to open particular muscles and strengthen others that have been overstretched, right? So have patience with this stuff. More often than not, in the standing posture, the hip points move forward and we go into a lordosis in that low back, right? So just kind of check what your tendencies are and just start to bring awareness to them. So again, hold it for one more breath if you can. Inhale as the feet root down. Arches, ankles, knees. Let some of that energy start to move up through the spinal column, through the crown of the head. But the shoulders, super soft. They have a little bit of weight as they soften down. Mountain pose. And again, it's the blueprint pose for every other standing pose. Tadasana foundational class. Namaste.